The sun was shining bright on this beautiful Saturday morning when David Johnson decided to take his 8-year-old daughter Maya to Oakwood Park. It had been a tough week at the auto repair shop where he worked, fixing cars from dawn to dusk. But weekends were special. They belonged to Maya. "Daddy, can we go to the park with the big swings?" Maya had asked that morning, her eyes sparkling with excitement. David couldn't say no to that sweet voice. After all, they had just moved to this new neighborhood 3 weeks ago, and Maya was still getting used to everything being different. The drive to Oakwood Park took only 10 minutes. As they pulled into the parking lot, David noticed how clean and well-maintained everything looked. The grass was perfectly cut, the playground equipment looked brand new, and there were beautiful flower beds everywhere. This was definitely a step up from their old neighborhood. "Wow, Daddy, look at those swings." Maya pointed toward the playground where several kids were already playing. The swings were indeed impressive, much higher and sturdier than the rusty ones at their old park. David locked the car and took Maya's small hand in his. "Remember what we talked about, sweetheart? Stay where I can see you, and if anyone asks, we live on Maple Street now." Maya nodded seriously. At 8 years old, she was smart enough to understand that some people might not be happy to see them in this fancy neighborhood. But David was determined to give his daughter the best life possible, even if it meant dealing with suspicious looks and whispered comments. They walked toward the playground together. David wore his favorite blue jeans and a clean white t-shirt. He always made sure to dress nicely when they went out, especially in their new neighborhood. First impressions mattered, and he wanted people to see that he was a respectable, hard-working father. The playground was busier than expected. There were about 15 kids running around, laughing and playing. Most of the parents sat on benches nearby, chatting with each other or scrolling through their phones. David found an empty bench with a good view of the swings and sat down. "Ahead, Maya. Have fun," he said with a smile. Maya ran toward the swings, her ponytails bouncing with each step. She was wearing her favorite purple dress, the one with little flowers on it that her grandmother had bought her for her birthday. David watched as she climbed onto a swing and started pumping her legs, trying to go higher and higher. For the first 20 minutes, everything was perfect. Maya made friends with a girl about her age, and they took turns pushing each other on the swings. David felt relaxed for the first time in weeks. Maybe this move was going to work out after all. He pulled out his phone to check the time, 11:30 a.m. They could stay for another hour before heading home for lunch. David looked around the park again, taking in the peaceful atmosphere. There were joggers on the walking trail, a group of teenagers playing basketball on the court, and several families having picnics on the grass. This was exactly the kind of environment he wanted Maya to grow up in. Safe, clean, and full of opportunities. He had worked double shifts for 6 months to save enough money for the deposit on their new apartment. It was smaller than their old place, but it was in a good school district, and that's what mattered most. David leaned back on the bench and closed his eyes for just a moment, enjoying the warm sunshine on his face. He could hear Maya's laughter mixing with the sounds of other children playing. For the first time since his wife had passed away 2 years ago, he felt like things were finally looking up. But that peaceful feeling wouldn't last much longer. David had no idea that someone had already noticed him and Maya, someone who didn't think they belonged in this neighborhood. Someone who was about to make a phone call that would change their perfect Saturday into something much darker. As David opened his eyes and looked around the park again, he noticed a woman across the playground staring at him. She was holding her phone up to her ear, speaking quietly but intensely. When their eyes met, she quickly looked away and walked in the opposite direction. A small knot formed in David's stomach. He had seen that look before, the suspicious glances, the whispered conversations, the way some people seemed uncomfortable when he and Maya showed up in certain places. He hoped he was just being paranoid, but deep down, he knew better. David checked on Maya, who was now on the monkey bars, trying to cross from one side to the other. She was laughing and seemed completely unaware of any tension. That's how it should be, David thought. Children shouldn't have to worry about such things. He pulled out his phone and texted his sister. "At the park with Maya. Beautiful day. Hope you're doing well." It was a simple message, but somehow writing it made him feel less alone. The next few minutes passed quietly. David watched Maya play while keeping an eye on the other adults in the park. Most seemed friendly enough, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and right now they were telling him to be careful. Little did David know that his instincts were absolutely right. A police car was already heading toward Oakwood Park, responding to a call about a suspicious person who didn't belong in the neighborhood. The caller had described David as potentially dangerous and claimed he was acting strange around the children. None of it was true, of course. David was simply a loving father enjoying a Saturday morning with his daughter. But in just a few minutes, his world was about to be turned upside down by someone who had already decided that he was guilty of something, simply because of how he looked and where he chose to spend his weekend. As Maya called out, "Daddy, watch this," and performed an impressive flip off the monkey bars, David smiled and waved, completely unaware that this might be the last peaceful moment they would share for quite some time. The sound of a car door slamming made David look up from watching Maya on the playground. A police cruiser had just parked near the entrance of Oakwood Park. David's heart started beating a little faster, but he told himself to stay calm. Police. Officers came to parks all the time, probably just a routine patrol. But as the officer stepped out of his car, David could tell this wasn't a friendly visit. The officer was tall and broad-shouldered, probably in his mid-40s, with graying hair and a stern expression. His name tag read Thompson, and he wore his uniform like someone who took his authority very seriously. Officer Thompson's eyes scanned the park slowly before landing directly on David. There was no mistaking it. David was exactly who he was looking for. The officer's jaw tightened as he started walking purposefully across the grass, his hand resting casually on his belt near his radio. David felt his mouth go dry. He had done nothing wrong, absolutely nothing, but he knew from experience that sometimes that didn't matter. He glanced over at Maya, who was still playing happily with her new friend on the slide. Should he call her over? Should he stay, seated? Every option seemed wrong. "Sir," Officer Thompson called out when he was still about 20 feet away. His voice was loud enough that several other parents turned to look. "I need to speak with you." David stood up slowly, keeping his hands visible. He had learned long ago that sudden movements could be misinterpreted. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem?" Thompson stopped about 6 feet away, close enough to be intimidating but far enough to maintain what he probably thought was a safe distance. "I received a call about a suspicious person in this area, someone who might not belong here." The words hit David like a punch to the stomach. Suspicious? For sitting on a bench watching his daughter play? "I'm sorry, officer, but I'm not sure what you mean. I'm just here with my daughter." He pointed toward Maya, who had noticed the police officer and was starting to walk over. "I'm going to need to see some identification," Thompson said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And I'll need to know what you're doing in this neighborhood." David reached slowly for his wallet, making sure to announce his movements. "I'm getting my driver's license from my back pocket." His hands were already starting to shake slightly, and he hated that Maya might see him like this. "Daddy?" Maya had reached them now, looking confused and a little scared. She was smart enough to sense the tension in the air. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. "This police officer just wants to check something. Why don't you go back and play for a few more minutes?" But Thompson stepped slightly closer, and Maya instinctively moved behind her father's legs. "Actually, I'd prefer if she stayed right here where I can see her," the officer said. The implication was clear. He thought David might be some kind of threat to children. David handed over his driver's license with a steady hand, even though inside he was burning with anger and humiliation. How was he supposed to explain this to Maya later? How could he tell his 8-year-old daughter that some people would always see them as threats no matter what they did or how they acted? Thompson examined the license carefully, taking much longer than necessary. "This address, Maple Street, that's pretty new, isn't it?" "We moved here 3 weeks ago," David replied. "I work at Peterson's Auto Repair downtown. We live in the apartment complex on Maple, Unit 4B. Uh-huh. Thompson's tone suggested he didn't believe a word of it. And what exactly are you doing in this park? David felt a flash of anger but forced himself to stay calm. I'm spending Saturday morning with my daughter. She likes the swings here. Now other parents in the park had started to notice what was happening. Some were trying to pretend they weren't watching, while others were openly staring. A few had their phones out, though David couldn't tell if they were recording or just checking messages. Sir, I'm going to need you to be more specific, Thompson continued. Did someone invite you here? Do you know anyone in this neighborhood? The questions were getting more ridiculous by the minute. Since when did you need an invitation to use a public park? Since when did you need to know someone to visit a playground with your child? Officer Thompson, David said, reading the name tag. I don't understand what I've done wrong. This is a public park. My daughter and I have every right to be here. Thompson's expression darkened. Sir, I'm going to need you to watch your tone. I'm conducting an investigation based on a legitimate complaint. What complaint? David asked. What exactly am I supposed to have done? Someone reported seeing you acting suspicious around the children's play area. They were concerned for the safety of the kids. Maya tugged on David's shirt. Daddy, what does suspicious mean? David's heart broke a little. How do you explain prejudice to an 8-year-old? How do you tell your daughter that some people will always think the worst of you no matter how good you are? It means the officer is just making sure everyone is safe, honey, David said softly. But Thompson wasn't satisfied with David's calm responses. If anything, they seemed to make him more aggressive. Sir, I find it very convenient that you just happened to move to this expensive neighborhood right around the time we've been having break-ins. Break-ins? David couldn't hide his shock. Officer, I work 60 hours a week fixing cars. I come home exhausted every night, help my daughter with her homework, and fall asleep watching cartoons with her. When exactly would I have time to break into anyone's house? That's exactly what someone would say if they were trying to cover their tracks, Thompson replied. Several more parents had gathered now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. David could feel their eyes on him, judging him, making assumptions. Some looked sympathetic, but others seemed to agree with the officer's suspicions. Maya pressed closer to her father's side. Daddy, I want to go home now. We will, sweetheart. Just as soon as the officer is finished asking his questions. But David had a sinking feeling that Thompson wasn't nearly finished. The officer's body language was becoming more aggressive, and his questions were getting more personal and invasive. This wasn't a routine check anymore. This was harassment, plain and simple, and the worst part was that Maya was seeing all of it. She was learning that sometimes, no matter how good you are or how carefully you follow the rules, some people will still treat you like a criminal. David just hoped they could get through this without things getting any worse. But as Thompson stepped even closer and put his hand back on his belt, David realized that this situation was far from over. Officer Thompson handed David's driver's license back, but his expression had grown even more hostile. The brief check had somehow confirmed his worst suspicions instead of putting them to rest. You know what I think? Thompson said, stepping closer until he was invading David's personal space. I think you're casing this neighborhood looking for easy targets. David felt his jaw clench, but he forced himself to stay calm. Maya was right there, watching everything, and he couldn't let her see him lose control. Officer, with all due respect, that's completely wrong. I've never stolen anything in my life. Right, Thompson said with a bitter laugh. And I suppose you just happened to pick the most expensive park in the city to bring your kid to play? It's not about money, David replied, trying to keep his voice steady. It's about safety and good schools. I want my daughter to have opportunities I never had. But Thompson wasn't listening anymore. He had already made up his mind about what kind of person David was. You people always have an excuse, don't you? Always playing the victim. The words hung in the air like a slap. You people. David felt something cold settle in his stomach. Maya looked up at him with confused eyes, not understanding the ugly undertone in the officer's voice, but sensing that something very wrong was happening. By now, a crowd of about 20 people had gathered around them. Some were parents who had been at the park with their children, others were joggers who had stopped to see what was happening, and a few were just curious passers-by. Most looked uncomfortable, but nobody was speaking up. David noticed that several people had their phones out now, and at least 3 were clearly recording the interaction. Part of him was grateful. If this went badly, at least there would be evidence. But another part of him was humiliated that his daughter had to experience this public spectacle. "Officer," David said, trying one more time to de-escalate the situation. "I've shown you my identification. I've answered all your questions. Is there anything else you need?" Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Yeah, there's something else I need. I need you to understand that this neighborhood has standards. We don't tolerate troublemakers here." "I'm not a troublemaker," David said firmly. "I'm a single father trying to give his daughter a good life." "Single? Father, huh?" Thompson's tone became even nastier. "Where's the mother? Let me guess. She couldn't handle your lifestyle?" David felt anger flash through him like lightning. Bringing up his wife who had died of cancer 2 years ago, was crossing a line that should never be crossed. But he could feel Maya's small hand gripping his leg, and he knew he had to stay strong for her. "My wife passed away," David said quietly. "We're doing our best to rebuild our lives." For just a moment, Thompson looked like he might back down. A few people in the crowd murmured sympathetically, but then his defensive anger kicked in, and he doubled down on his aggression. "Oh, so now I'm supposed to feel sorry for you?" Thompson said. "You think having a sob story gives you the right to show up anywhere you want?" Maya started to cry. The stress and confusion of the situation had finally overwhelmed her 8-year-old mind. She didn't understand why this man was being so mean to her daddy, or why all these people were standing around watching like they were some kind of entertainment. "Hey, it's okay, sweetheart," David said, kneeling down to Maya's level. "Don't cry. Everything's going to be fine." But Thompson wasn't done. "Don't you turn your back on me when I'm talking to you." David stood up slowly, his patience finally wearing thin. "Officer, you've checked my ID. You've asked your questions. My daughter is upset and I'd like to take her home now. You'll leave when I say you can leave," Thompson snapped. "And right now I'm not satisfied with your answers." An older woman in the crowd spoke up. "Officer, the man hasn't done anything wrong. He's just here with his little girl." Thompson spun around to face her. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back and let me do my job." But the woman's comment had opened the floodgates. Other people started speaking up too. "This is ridiculous," said a man in a jogging outfit. "They've been here for an hour and the kid was just playing on the swings." "I saw the whole thing," added a mother with a stroller. "He's been nothing but polite and respectful." Thompson's face was turning red now. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a crowd of civilians. "All of you need to disperse immediately, or I'll cite you for interfering with a police investigation." "What investigation?" called out someone from the back of the crowd. "Sitting on a bench while your kid plays isn't a crime." David could see that Thompson was losing control of the situation, and that made him even more dangerous. A humiliated police officer with something to prove was not someone you wanted to be dealing with, especially when you had your child with you. "Maya," David said softly, "I want you to go stand by that nice lady over there, okay?" He pointed to the woman with the stroller who had spoken up for them. "No, Daddy," Maya said, clinging to his leg. "I want to stay with you." "Sir, your daughter stays right where she is," Thompson ordered. "Nobody moves until I say so." The crowd was getting larger now, and the mood was shifting. What had started as curious onlooking was becoming something more like protective anger. People were starting to see this for what it really was. A man being harassed for no good reason while his frightened daughter watched. David could feel the situation spinning out of control. Thompson was backed into a corner by the crowd's disapproval, and David knew from experience that cornered people do desperate things. He had to find a way to end this peacefully before something terrible happened. But as Thompson's hand moved toward his radio, presumably to call for backup, David realized that peaceful resolution might no longer be an option. This officer was determined to prove something, even if it meant traumatizing an innocent child in the process. Maya's sobs were getting louder, and David felt his protective instincts kicking in. Whatever happened next, he was going to make sure his daughter was safe, even if it meant putting himself at risk. The crowd continued to grow, and Thompson continued to escalate. Everyone could feel that something bad was about to happen, but nobody knew how to stop it. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officer Thompson was clearly frustrated that the crowd wasn't backing down, and his authority was being questioned by ordinary citizens. David could see the anger building in the officer's face, the red cheeks, the clenched jaw, the way his hands kept moving to his belt. "I said disperse," Thompson shouted at the crowd. "This is official police business." But the crowd wasn't moving. If anything, more people were joining them. Word was spreading through the park that something unfair was happening, and people were drawn to witness it. Some were recording with their phones, others were just watching in disbelief. Maya was still crying, clinging to her father's leg like a scared koala. David put his hand gently on her head, trying to comfort her while keeping his eyes on Thompson. "It's okay, baby girl. Everything's going to be fine." "No, it's not fine," Thompson exploded. "Nothing about this situation is fine. You don't belong here, and everyone knows it." The raw hatred in Thompson's voice made several people in the crowd gasp. There was no hiding it anymore. This wasn't about suspicious behavior or neighborhood safety. This was about something much uglier and more personal. "Officer Thompson," David said carefully, "I think we've all had enough excitement for one day. I'm going to take my daughter home now." He took Maya's hand and started to turn away from the officer. It should have been over. David wasn't being arrested, he wasn't being cited, and he was voluntarily leaving the area. Any reasonable person would have let them go. But Thompson wasn't feeling reasonable. "Don't you walk away from me!" the officer yelled, lunging forward and grabbing David's shoulder roughly. "I didn't say you could leave." The aggressive contact sent David stumbling backward. He managed to keep his balance, but just barely. Maya screamed and ran to hide behind a nearby park bench, terrified by the sudden violence. "Sir, you need to calm down," David said, raising his hands peacefully. "I'm not resisting anything. I'm not running away. I just want to take my daughter home." But Thompson was beyond listening to reason now. The crowd's disapproval, David's calm responses, and his own inability to control the situation had pushed him over the edge. He was going to show everyone who was in charge here, regardless of the consequences. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" Thompson snarled, getting right in David's face. "Think you can just move into our neighborhood and act like you own the place?" "I don't think I own anything," David replied steadily. "I just think I have the same rights as everyone else." Those words, the simple assertion that he deserved equal treatment, seemed to infuriate Thompson even more. Without warning, he shoved David hard in the chest with both hands. David staggered backward several steps, windmilling his arms to keep from falling. The crowd erupted in shocked cries and angry shouts. Several people yelled, "Hey," and "Stop," but nobody moved to physically intervene. "Daddy!" Maya screamed from behind the bench. David regained his balance and immediately put his hands up again, showing he had no intention of fighting back. "Officer, please, my daughter is watching. She's scared." "She should be scared," Thompson shouted. "Maybe if more people were scared of the consequences, we wouldn't have problems like this." The officer reached for his handcuffs, apparently deciding that he was going to arrest David for something, anything, just to justify his actions. But as he fumbled with the cuffs, his coordination affected by his rage, David instinctively took a step back to protect himself. That small defensive movement was all the excuse Thompson needed. "He's resisting arrest," the officer yelled, though he hadn't actually announced that David was under arrest for anything. "He's trying to flee." Before David could respond, before he could explain that he was just trying to avoid being grabbed, again, Thompson's open hand came flying toward his face in a vicious slap that echoed across the park like a gunshot. The blow caught David across his left cheek and jaw, snapping his head to the side and leaving a bright red handprint on his dark skin. For a moment, everything went silent except for Maya's heartbroken sobbing. David stood there stunned, his face burning with pain and humiliation. In all his 32 years, no one had ever struck him like that. not even the bullies in school, had been so deliberately cruel and degrading. The crowd exploded in outrage. "That's assault," someone yelled. "You can't do that," shouted another voice. "Someone call his supervisor. This is police brutality." Several phones were definitely recording now, capturing every moment of Thompson's loss of control. The officer looked around at the angry faces surrounding him and seemed to realize for the first time that he might have gone too far. But instead of backing down or apologizing, Thompson doubled down on his aggression. "He was resisting arrest," he insisted to the crowd. "You all saw him trying to run." "We saw you attack an innocent man," shouted the woman with the stroller. "That little girl is watching her father get beaten up for no reason," added the jogger. David touched his throbbing cheek gingerly, tasting blood where his teeth had cut the inside of his mouth. But his first thought wasn't about his own pain, it was about Maya. He turned to look at her behind the bench and his heart shattered. His 8-year-old daughter was curled up in a ball, crying so hard she could barely breathe. She had just watched a police officer, someone who was supposed to protect people, attack her father for no reason at all. How do you explain that to a child? How do you help them understand a world where such things are possible? "Maya, sweetheart," David called softly, not daring to move toward her while Thompson was still so volatile. "Daddy's okay. Everything's going to be fine." But even as he said the words, David knew they weren't true. Nothing about this was fine, and things were likely to get worse before they got better. Thompson was looking around at the hostile crowd, realizing that his actions had been witnessed and recorded by dozens of people. His career was probably over, and he might even face criminal charges. That knowledge made him more dangerous than ever because now he had nothing left to lose. The officer's hand moved toward his radio again, presumably to call for backup. But David wondered if backup would make things better or worse. Would other officers see through Thompson's lies, or would they close ranks to protect one of their own? As the crowd continued to shout their disapproval and Maya continued to sob, David realized that this situation was spiraling completely out of control. Someone needed to step in and stop this madness before it escalated into something even more tragic. But who? Who had the authority to stop a police officer who had clearly lost his mind? As if in answer to his prayer, David heard a calm, authoritative voice cutting through the chaos. A voice that would change everything. "That's enough." The voice was quiet but carried such authority that the entire crowd fell silent. Even Maya stopped crying for a moment to look around. The words weren't shouted or aggressive, but something about them commanded instant attention. Tall figure was walking through the crowd, and people automatically stepped aside to let him pass. He was probably in his early 70s, with long gray hair pulled back in a ponytail and dressed casually in dark jeans and a simple black t-shirt. He moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades studying martial arts, and his presence was both calming and intimidating at the same time. David recognized him immediately, and so did several other people in the crowd. Whispers started rippling through the group. "Is that? Oh my God, it is. I can't believe it." Steven Seagal had been quietly sitting on a bench near the basketball court, taking a break from filming a movie scene downtown. He had been watching the entire confrontation unfold, growing more and more disturbed by Officer Thompson's behavior. When Thompson struck David, Seagal knew he couldn't just sit there and watch anymore. Officer Thompson turned to see who had spoken, and his face went through a series of rapid changes, confusion, recognition, and then something that looked almost like panic. Here was a man who was not only famous and influential, but who also happened to be a reserve deputy sheriff in Louisiana and had extensive law enforcement training. "Sir, this is a police matter," Thompson said, trying to regain his composure. "I'm going to need you to step back." Seagal continued walking forward until he was standing between Thompson and David. "I've been watching this police matter for the past 20 minutes, he said calmly. "And what I've seen is an officer harassing and then assaulting an innocent man while his young daughter watches." Thompson's face was rapidly turning red again. Being challenged by ordinary citizens was one thing, but being called out by a celebrity, especially one with law enforcement connections, was something entirely different. "You don't know what you're talking about," Thompson sputtered. This man was acting suspicious. He was resisting arrest. Really? Seagal raised an eyebrow. Because from what I observed, he answered all your questions politely, showed you his identification without resistance, and was trying to leave peacefully when you physically attacked him. Several people in the crowd murmured their agreement. The cell phone cameras were now focused on this unexpected confrontation between the movie star and the police officer. David was still holding his stinging cheek, hardly believing what he was seeing. Of all the people who could have stepped in to help, it was Seagal, a man known for playing tough guy heroes who fought against injustice. It seemed almost too surreal to be real. Maya had stopped crying and was peeking out from behind the bench, fascinated by this new person who wasn't afraid of the mean police officer. She didn't know who he was, but she could tell that he was trying to help her daddy. "Sir, I'm warning you," Thompson said, his voice shaking slightly. "Interfering with a police investigation is a crime." Seagal smiled slightly, but there was no humor in it. So is assault, so is harassment, so is violating someone's civil rights. He paused and looked directly into Thompson's eyes. "And I have it all on video." Thompson's face went white. "What?" Seagal held up his phone. "I've been recording since you first grabbed this man's shoulder. Everything is documented. Your threats, your illegal demands, and especially that completely unprovoked attack." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Finally, someone with real influence had witnessed Thompson's behavior and was willing to hold him accountable. "You can't do that," Thompson protested weakly. "Actually, I can," Seagal replied. "This is a public place and recording police interactions is completely legal. In fact, I'd say it's a civic duty when those interactions involve abuse of power." David felt a wave of relief wash over him. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt like someone was on his side. Someone who couldn't be bullied or intimidated. "Sir," David said to Seagal, "thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Seagal turned to look at David and his expression softened with genuine concern. "Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" David touched his face again. It was swollen and probably bruised, but nothing was broken. "I think I'm okay. I'm more worried about my daughter." Both men looked over at Maya, who was still hiding behind the bench but watching everything with wide eyes. Seagal's expression grew even more serious when he saw how frightened the little girl was. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Seagal asked gently, kneeling down to Maya's level. "Maya," she whispered. "That's a beautiful name. I'm Stephen. Are you okay?" Maya nodded, but her eyes kept darting nervously toward Officer Thompson. Seagal stood up and faced Thompson again. "Do you see what you've done? Do you see how you've terrorized this child? She's going to remember this day for the rest of her life." Thompson was looking around frantically now, realizing that the situation had completely gotten away from him. The crowd was hostile. He was being recorded by multiple people, and now a celebrity with law enforcement connections was directly challenging his actions. "I was just doing my job," Thompson said weakly. "No," Seagal replied firmly. "Your job is to protect and serve. Your job is to keep people safe. What you did here today was the exact opposite of that." More people were gathering now, drawn by the commotion and the news that Steven Seagal was involved. Some were taking pictures, others were calling friends, and a few were even calling local news stations. Thompson seemed to realize that this was about to become a very public scandal. His hand moved toward his radio again. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Seagal said calmly. "Calling for backup to help cover up your misconduct is only going to make things worse." "I'm not covering up anything," Thompson snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. "Good," Seagal replied. "Then you won't mind when I send this video to the police chief, the mayor, and every news outlet in the city." Thompson's face went from red to white to green in the span of a few seconds. The full implications of what had happened were finally sinking in. His career was over, his reputation was destroyed, and he was probably going to face criminal charges. But Seagal wasn't done yet. He had witnessed an injustice and he was determined to see it made right. "David," he said, turning to the young father, "I think it's time we called this officer's supervisor, don't you?" Officer Thompson looked like a cornered animal. His eyes darted frantically between Steven Seagal, the growing crowd, and the multiple cell phones recording his every move. The confident, aggressive demeanor he had displayed just minutes earlier was completely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like terror. "You don't understand," Thompson said, his voice cracking slightly. "I got a call. Someone reported suspicious activity. I was just following protocol." Seagal crossed his arms and studied the officer with the calm intensity of someone who had dealt with bullies his entire life. "Protocol? Is it protocol to refuse to tell someone what they're suspected of? Is it protocol to make racist comments? Is it protocol to physically assault someone who's cooperating fully?" Each question hit Thompson like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could he say? Everything Seagal had mentioned was captured on video, witnessed by dozens of people. David was still holding Maya's hand, trying to process what was happening. 20 minutes ago, he had been just another father having a peaceful Saturday with his daughter. Now he was at the center of what was clearly going to become a major incident. "Maya, baby," David said softly. "Why don't you go sit on that bench over there? The nice people will make sure you're safe while Daddy talks to these men." The woman, with the stroller, immediately stepped forward. "I'll watch her," she said kindly. "Maya, sweetie, do you want to see my baby? Her name is Emma, and she's only 6 months old." Maya looked at her father, who nodded encouragingly. She was still scared, but she was also curious about the baby. She walked over to the woman, who immediately put a protective arm around her. "Thank you," David said gratefully. At least Maya wouldn't have to witness whatever came next. Seagal pulled out his phone and started dialing. "I'm calling the police department directly," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This officer's supervisor needs to know what's happening here." "Wait," Thompson said desperately. "You don't need to do that. Look, maybe I came on a little strong, but this is just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Seagal's voice rose slightly, showing the first crack in his calm demeanor. "You called this man, you people. You accused him of casing houses, for break-ins with no evidence whatsoever. You physically assaulted him in front of his 8-year-old daughter. What exactly is there to misunderstand?" Thompson's face went through several color changes as he realized there was no way to talk his way out of this. The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses were numerous, and his actions had been recorded from multiple angles. "Hello," Seagal said into his phone. "I need to speak with the watch commander immediately. This is Steven Seagal, and I'm witnessing what appears to be a serious case of police misconduct at Oakwood Park." Even from several feet away, David could hear the voice on the other end of the phone suddenly become much more attentive. Having a celebrity call to report police brutality was the kind of thing that got supervisors' attention very quickly. "Yes, I'll hold," Seagal said. He looked at Thompson while waiting. "You know, I've worked with a lot of police officers over the years. Good cops, dedicated cops, people who really care about protecting their communities. You're nothing like them." Thompson tried one more desperate play. "Look, I've got 20 years on the force. I've got commendations, awards. I'm not some rogue cop." "Then this is even more disappointing," Seagal replied. "Someone with your experience should know better. You should be setting an example for younger officers, not showing them that it's okay to abuse your power." A woman in the crowd called out, "I've been recording this whole thing too. I'm sending it to Channel 7 News right now." "So am I," shouted someone else. "This is going viral." Thompson looked like he was about to be sick. In the age of social media, police misconduct could spread around the world in a matter of hours. By tonight, everyone would know his name and what he had done. "Yes, I'm still here," Seagal said into his phone. "Yes, at Oakwood Park on Elm Street. Officer Thompson, badge number?" He looked at Thompson's uniform. "What's your badge number?" Thompson hesitated, then mumbled, 4762. "Badge number 4762, Seagal continued. "Yes, I have video evidence. Multiple witnesses. The victim is here with me now, along with his young daughter who witnessed the entire attack." David could hear the urgency in the voice on the other end of the phone. Whoever Seagal was talking to was clearly taking this very seriously. They'll be here in 5 minutes, Seagal said, hanging up. Sergeant Rodriguez is coming personally. Thompson's shoulders sagged in defeat. Sergeant Rodriguez was known throughout the department as someone who didn't tolerate misconduct from his officers. If Rodriguez was coming personally, it meant this was being treated as a major incident. David, Seagal said, turning to the young father, how are you feeling? Any dizziness, nausea, blurred vision? David touched his swollen cheek again. I don't think so. It hurts, but I don't think anything's broken. We should still have paramedics take a look at you, Seagal said. Head and face injuries can be tricky. I'm fine, really, David insisted. I just want to make sure Maya's okay. They both looked over at Maya, who was now sitting on the bench with the woman and her baby. She was still obviously shaken, but she was no longer crying. The woman was talking to her softly, probably trying to distract her from what had happened. She's a brave little girl, Seagal observed. But she shouldn't have had to see this. No, she shouldn't, David agreed. His voice was heavy with sadness and anger. How do I explain this to her? How do I tell my 8-year-old daughter that some people will always see us as threats no matter what we do? Seagal was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Maybe you start by telling her that most people aren't like him, he said, nodding toward Thompson. Look around at this crowd. Look at how many people spoke up for you, how many people were outraged by what they saw. That tells you something about humanity. David looked around at the faces surrounding them. Seagal was right. Most of the people looked angry on his behalf, not at him. Many had tried to defend him even before Seagal arrived. But there will always be people like him, David said quietly. Yes, Seagal acknowledged. There will. But there will also always be people willing to stand up to them. That's what you tell Maya. You tell her that when bad things happen, good people have a responsibility to step in and make them right. In the distance, they could hear sirens approaching. Sergeant Rodriguez was coming, probably with backup and maybe paramedics too. Thompson's day of reckoning was about to begin. But for David, this was about more than just one bad cop getting his comeuppance. This was about teaching his daughter that justice was possible, that standing up for what's right mattered, and that even when the system failed them, there were still people willing to fight for them. As the sirens got closer, Thompson seemed to shrink into himself more and more. His moment of unchecked power was over, and now he would have to face the consequences of his actions. And thanks to Steven Seagal's intervention, those consequences would be very real indeed.